Today, we're sharing a story that will touch your heart, a tale of love, loss, and the unbreakable bonds of family. When a grieving single father unexpectedly finds a baby left on his doorstep, his life is turned upside down. Who left the child there? And why was he chosen to care for her? As he unravels the mystery behind the baby's arrival, he discovers a connection to the child's ailing mother, a woman whose courage and love inspire him to fight for her daughter's future. But this isn't just a story of survival. It's a journey through heartbreak, hope, and a second chance at love that will keep you guessing until the very end. What would you do if faced with such an unexpected responsibility? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Like this video to support content that moves and uplifts you. Now, let's dive into the beginning of this incredible journey. Ethan Parker's evenings were predictable, a quiet glass of bourbon in his study, his dog Max curled up near the fireplace, and the faint hum of the city outside his expansive estate. It was a life meticulously planned and controlled, far removed from the chaos of his childhood or the dizzying demands of his earlier career. Tonight was no different. Ethan leaned back in his leather armchair, the dim light from his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls lined with books. The world outside was cold and silent, the kind of night where people stayed indoors, wrapped in warmth. So, when the faint sound of a baby's cry reached his ears, Ethan froze. He glanced at Max, who perked up, ears twitching. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable. A child's cry, cutting through the stillness of the night. Ethan stood, setting his glass down carefully. His steps were measured as he walked to the front door, the sound growing louder with each step. Unlocking the heavy oak door, he pulled it open, and there on the doorstep was a sight he could hardly comprehend. A baby. The child was swaddled in a thin blanket, nestled in a small basket with a folded piece of paper tucked inside. Her tiny face was red from crying, her arms flailing weakly. Ethan's first instinct was disbelief. His hands hovered over the basket, as if touching it would confirm the absurdity of what he was seeing. "Oh," he murmured, scanning the empty street. The night offered no answers, only a biting wind that made the baby's cry sharper. Bringing the basket inside, Ethan placed it gently on the kitchen counter. Max followed, sniffing curiously, but keeping a respectful distance. Ethan unfolded the note, his pulse quickening as he read the shaky handwriting. "Her name is Sophie. I can't take care of her anymore. Please keep her safe. I know you'll do the right thing." That was all. No name, no explanation, just an imploration that left Ethan reeling. He looked at the baby, who had quieted down, her wide, tearful eyes staring up at him. Her small fingers grasped at the air, seeking comfort. "Who are you?" he asked softly, though he knew she couldn't answer. His mind raced. Should he call the police? Child Protective Services? This wasn't his responsibility. Ethan was a businessman, not a parent. And yet, he couldn't ignore the weight of the note or the vulnerability of the child before him. Taking a deep breath, Ethan picked up the baby. She fit awkwardly in his arms, her weight both unfamiliar and grounding. The next morning, Ethan was on the phone with Claire, his longtime housekeeper and confidant. "You're telling me someone just left a baby on your doorstep?" Claire's voice was sharp, disbelief coloring every word. "Yes," Ethan replied, cradling Sophie, who was now dozing in a borrowed blanket. "And the note says her name is Sophie. That's all I know." "Well, you can't keep her," Claire said firmly. "What do you know about raising a baby?" "Nothing," Ethan admitted. "But she's here, and I'm not just going to abandon her." Claire sighed. "I'll be over in an hour. We'll figure this out." When Claire arrived, her no-nonsense demeanor immediately took over. She inspected Sophie, ensured she was healthy, and began organizing supplies. "You're serious about keeping her, aren't you?" she asked, her tone softening as she watched Ethan gently feed Sophie from a bottle. "I don't know what I'm doing," Ethan confessed. "But I can't just hand her off to strangers." Claire smiled faintly. "You're a good man, Ethan, but this is going to change your life." Over the next few days, Ethan threw himself into finding answers. He hired a private investigator, Jacob Hart, to track down Sophie's mother. Meanwhile, his life began to shift in ways he hadn't anticipated. Late nights in the study were replaced by late-night feedings. His meticulously organized schedule was disrupted by Sophie's unpredictable needs. And yet, as exhausting as it was, Ethan found himself drawn to the child. Her tiny giggles and curious eyes brought a light to his home that had been absent for years. One evening, as Sophie drifted off in his arms, Ethan found himself whispering, "Whoever left you here, thank you." Jacob's report came 2 weeks later. Ethan read it in his study, his heart sinking with each page. Sophie's mother, Maya Harris, was a single woman working as a waitress in a small diner. She had been evicted from her apartment and had recently been diagnosed with a severe illness. "She's struggling, Ethan," Jacob said during their meeting. "From what I've gathered, leaving Sophie with you wasn't abandonment. It was desperation." Ethan clenched his fists, anger and pity swirling within him. He couldn't imagine the pain it must have taken for Maya to leave her child behind. "Find her," he said firmly. "I need to talk to her." Ethan had always prided himself on discipline, early to bed, early to rise, a structured life designed for maximum efficiency. But Sophie shattered that routine in a single night. It started with a soft whimper around midnight. Ethan, who had been lying awake, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the stranger who had entrusted him with the child, bolted upright. He made his way to the crib Claire had set up in the corner of the guest room. Sophie's small face was scrunched, her fists clenched as the whimpering turned into a full-throated cry. Okay, I'm here," Ethan murmured, unsure if his words would comfort her. He picked her up, her tiny body trembling against his chest. She cried harder. "Right? You're hungry, aren't you?" he guessed, recalling the instructions Claire had given him earlier. Fumbling in the dark, Ethan prepared a bottle of formula. By the time he returned, Sophie's cries had subsided to hiccups, but her little hands reached out eagerly for the bottle. As she fed, Ethan sat in the rocking chair, the quiet hum of the night settling around them. He marveled at her tiny features, the soft curve of her cheeks, her button nose, the faint wisps of hair on her head. "You've turned my life upside down, kid," he whispered. Sophie's eyes fluttered closed, her breathing evening out. Ethan sat there long after she had fallen asleep, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Ethan's high-profile status ensured that nothing in his life stayed private for long. By the end of the week, rumors began to swirl speculation about the mysterious baby in his care, whispers of an affair, and tabloid headlines screaming, "Billionaire's secret daughter." Ethan scrolled through the headlines, his jaw tightening. Claire walked in, holding Sophie. "You've seen it, haven't you?" "Hard to miss," Ethan muttered, tossing his phone onto the counter. "This is what happens when you're Ethan Parker," Claire said with a sigh. "Everyone wants a piece of your story." "I don't care what they say about me," Ethan replied, his voice cold. "But I won't let them drag Sophie into this." He spent the day on the phone with his PR team, crafting a statement that was firm but evasive. The child in question is under Mr. Parker's care temporarily. He requests privacy while the situation is resolved. But the damage was done. Paparazzi camped outside his gates, and every trip to the pediatrician or the grocery store became a spectacle. That night, as Sophie babbled happily on her playmat, Ethan watched her with a mixture of awe and worry. "They can write whatever they want about me," he said softly, "but I'll protect you from all of it. That's a promise." Despite the chaos, Ethan found himself drawn deeper into Sophie's world. Her needs were constant and demanding, yet fulfilling in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room, stacking blocks with Sophie. She clapped her hands as the tower grew taller, her laughter infectious. "You think this is funny, huh?" Ethan said, grinning. With a decisive swipe, Sophie knocked the tower over, squealing with delight. Ethan laughed, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Claire, watching from the doorway, smiled. "You're a natural, you know?" Ethan looked up, startled. "A natural at what?" "Being a dad," Claire said simply. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He had never considered himself father material. His own father had been distant, a shadowy figure more concerned with profits than parenting. I'm just trying to keep her alive, he said, brushing off the compliment. But later that night, as he tucked Sophie into her crib and watched her tiny chest rise and fall, he wondered if Claire might be right. Jacob Hart, Ethan's private investigator, was nothing if not thorough. When he called with an update, Ethan was ready. I've tracked down a few people who knew Sophie's mother, Jacob began. A waitress at a diner in the city. Name's Maya Harris. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. And she's had a rough go, Jacob continued. Lost her husband in a car accident 2 years ago. Struggled to make ends meet ever since. She was evicted from her apartment last month, and that's when she disappeared. Ethan felt a pang of guilt. He had assumed Sophie's mother had simply abandoned her, but the picture Jacob painted was one of desperation. Do you know where she is now? Ethan asked. Jacob hesitated. Not yet, but I have a lead. I'll let you know when I find her. After hanging up, Ethan sat in silence, his thoughts a whirlwind. He looked at Sophie, who was playing with a plush toy on the rug. Your mom didn't give up on you, he said softly. She was trying to save you. Jacob's lead paid off sooner than expected. Maya Harris had been seen at a shelter on the outskirts of the city. Ethan didn't hesitate. The shelter was modest, a nondescript building with peeling paint and a faded sign. Ethan entered, feeling out of place in his tailored suit. I'm looking for Maya Harris, he told the receptionist. The woman hesitated, her eyes scanning his face. She's here, but I have to warn you, she's not in great shape. Ethan's chest tightened as he was led to a small common room. Maya sat on a worn couch, her shoulders slumped and her face pale. She looked up as they entered, her eyes widening when she saw Ethan. You're him, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man I left Sophie with. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. Yes, I'm Ethan Parker. Tears filled Maya's eyes as she clasped her hands together. Is she okay? Is Sophie okay? She's more than okay, Ethan replied, his voice softening. She's thriving. Maya let out a shaky breath, her relief palpable. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for taking care of her. Ethan sat down across from her, his expression serious. Maya, I need to understand. Why did you leave her with me? Her gaze dropped to her lap. Because I was dying, she said simply. And I couldn't let her go down with me. Ethan sat across from Maya in the shelter's dimly lit common room, his mind racing. He had expected anger, maybe accusations, but the sorrow in Maya's eyes disarmed him. Start from the beginning, Ethan urged gently. Maya clasped her hands tightly, her fingers trembling. It's not a story I'm proud of, she said, her voice thick with emotion. She began to recount her life, a childhood marked by poverty, her whirlwind romance with Sophie's father, Daniel, and their dreams of building a better future together. But Daniel's death in a car accident had left her devastated and alone. I tried, she said, her voice breaking. I worked every shift I could, but bills piled up. Sophie needed formula, diapers, a safe place to sleep, and I couldn't give her any of that. Her gaze dropped to the table. When I was diagnosed, it felt like the last nail in the coffin. The doctor said I had a rare condition, advanced and aggressive. My body was failing, and I couldn't risk Sophie being left with no one. Ethan's chest tightened as he listened. Maya's choices, though heartbreaking, made sense in their own tragic way. But why me? Ethan asked. Maya met his gaze, tears streaming down her cheeks. Because I saw you that day at the diner. You were kind to your staff, even when you thought no one was watching. You left a generous tip for someone who had messed up your order. You seemed safe. I didn't have anyone else. Ethan leaned back, the weight of her words settling over him. You trusted me with the most important thing in your life. She nodded. And I was right, wasn't I? The silence between them stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. Ethan finally spoke, his voice steady. Maya, you're not alone anymore. You don't have to keep fighting this battle by yourself. Her eyes widened, confusion flickering across her face. What are you saying? I'm saying you have a place with us, Ethan replied. With me and Sophie. We'll get you the medical care you need, and you can be part of her life. Maya shook her head, disbelief etched into her features. Ethan, I don't even know if I have time left. I don't want Sophie to get attached, only to lose me all over again. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. You don't know how much time you have, but isn't that all the more reason to spend it with her? We'll figure it out together. You trusted me once, Maya. Trust me again. Her lip quivered, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. The transition was anything but smooth. Maya moved into Ethan's guest house, a modest space compared to the grandeur of his estate, but perfect for her needs. Sophie was thrilled to have her mother nearby, though she clung to Ethan just as tightly. Maya spent her days recovering, attending doctor's appointments, and learning to navigate her new reality. Ethan spared no expense in securing the best medical care, hiring a specialist who introduced a promising but experimental treatment plan. Despite the challenges, moments of joy began to seep into their lives. One evening, Ethan found Maya and Sophie sitting on a blanket in the garden, surrounded by toys. Sophie was giggling uncontrollably as Maya pretended to steal her nose. "You're good with her," Ethan remarked, joining them. "She's the only reason I'm still here," Maya admitted, her smile softening. "And I'll do whatever it takes to be here for her as long as I can." Ethan felt a pang of admiration. Despite her struggles, Maya's love for Sophie burned brighter than anything he had ever seen. Maya's presence brought unexpected changes to Ethan's life. Claire, initially wary of Maya, began to warm up to her. "She's tougher than she looks," Claire remarked one afternoon as they prepared dinner. "She's been through more than most people could handle," Ethan agreed. Jacob, too, found himself impressed by Maya's resilience. He offered to help her with legal matters, ensuring Sophie's future would be secure no matter what happened. But not everyone was as supportive. Ethan's business associates questioned his decisions, warning him about the potential risks to his reputation. "Taking in a child is one thing," one of them said during a meeting. "But this situation could get complicated." Ethan's response was swift and firm. "My personal life isn't up for discussion. Focus on the business." Maya overheard the conversation and confronted Ethan later. "You don't have to defend me," she said. "Yes, I do," he replied. "Because you're part of this family now." For a while, life settled into a fragile rhythm. Sophie thrived under the care of both Ethan and Maya, her laughter filling the halls of the estate. Maya began to regain her strength, though the treatments were grueling. She and Ethan grew closer, their shared love for Sophie forging a bond neither had anticipated. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Maya turned to Ethan. "Do you ever wonder how we ended up here?" "All the time," he admitted. "But I'm glad we did." Maya smiled, her gaze distant. "I used to think Sophie would be better off without me. Now, I can't imagine not being here for her." "You're stronger than you think," Ethan said. "And you're not alone anymore." As the days turned into weeks, their fragile peace was threatened by an unexpected setback. Maya's condition began to worsen, despite the treatments. Ethan refused to give up, pushing the doctors to explore every possible option. Maya, however, began to prepare herself for the worst. "Promise me something," she said to Ethan one night. "Anything," he replied. "If I can't stay, promise me you'll love her enough for both of us." Ethan's chest tightened, but he nodded. "I promise." Maya's days were a mix of cautious hope and grueling treatments. The experimental therapy left her weak and nauseous, but it also offered moments of improvement, a renewed sparkle in her eyes, fleeting bursts of energy that allowed her to join Sophie and Ethan in the garden or read bedtime stories. For Sophie, having her mother close brought endless joy. Maya's laugh, though soft, became a familiar melody in the house. Sophie's favorite game was hide and seek, which she insisted on playing with both Ethan and Maya. Though Maya couldn't move as quickly, her creativity outshone her physical limits. "I'll never forget the time I hid under the dining table," Maya said one evening, laughing with Ethan after Sophie had gone to bed. "She found me because I sneezed." Ethan chuckled, his eyes lingering on Maya's face. "You're good for her. She's happier now with you here." "She's my world," Maya replied, her smile faltering. "But Ethan, what if I can't stay?" Ethan's voice softened. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, you're here. That's what matters." The weight of her condition never left the room entirely, but in moments like this, it faded into the background, replaced by shared laughter and hope. Ethan and Maya's relationship continued to evolve, built on late-night conversations, shared meals, and their mutual love for Sophie. One evening, Ethan returned from a particularly taxing business meeting to find Maya waiting for him in the kitchen. She had prepared a simple dinner, something she rarely had the energy to do, but her face lit up when he walked in. "You didn't have to do this," Ethan said, touched. "I wanted to," Maya replied. "You've done so much for me and Sophie. It's the least I can do." As they ate, their conversation drifted from light-hearted anecdotes to deeper topics: Maya's dreams before her illness, Ethan struggles with loneliness despite his success. "I used to think having money would solve everything," Ethan admitted. "But it turns out, it doesn't fill the emptiness." Maya reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You're not empty, Ethan. You've opened your home and your heart to us. That's more than most people would do." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the unspoken connection between them felt almost tangible. Maya's progress took a sudden turn when she collapsed one afternoon while playing with Sophie in the garden. Ethan, who had been on a call inside, rushed out at the sound of Sophie's panicked cries. "Mama fell," Sophie sobbed, clutching Ethan's leg as he knelt beside Maya. Maya's breathing was shallow, her face pale. Ethan scooped her up and carried her to the car, his heart pounding as he sped to the hospital. Dr. Patel, Maya's lead specialist, met them in the emergency room. After running a series of tests, she pulled Ethan aside. "She's experiencing a severe reaction to the treatment," Dr. Patel explained. "It's not uncommon, but we'll need to monitor her closely. The next 48 hours are critical." Ethan stayed by Maya's bedside through the night, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Sophie stayed with Claire, who reassured her that her mother was in good hands. When Maya finally opened her eyes the next morning, Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You scared me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Maya smiled weakly. "Scared myself too." Though her recovery was slow, the incident left both of them shaken, a stark reminder of how fragile their situation was. The weeks following Maya's collapse were marked by caution. She rested more, followed her treatment plan meticulously, and leaned on Ethan in ways she hadn't before. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Ethan broached a topic he'd been avoiding. "Maya, have you thought about what you want for Sophie if—" He hesitated, not wanting to finish the sentence. Maya nodded, her expression solemn. "I have, and I trust you, Ethan. If I can't be here, I know you'll take care of her." "I will," Ethan promised. "But you're not giving up, right?" "Never," Maya said, her voice firm. "But it's comforting to know she'll have you, no matter what." Their bond deepened that night, forged in shared determination and an unspoken acknowledgement of the challenges ahead. As Maya's treatment continued, there were small victories: a day without nausea, an afternoon spent chasing Sophie in the yard, a heartfelt laugh shared with Ethan. Dr. Patel introduced a new therapy that showed promising results. Though it was too early to declare success, Maya's energy began to return, and her optimism grew. "I feel like myself again," she said one morning as she prepared breakfast with Ethan. "You look stronger," Ethan said, watching her with a mix of admiration and relief. Sophie ran into the kitchen, giggling as she clutched a drawing. "Look, Mama, it's us." The crayon drawing depicted a smiling family: Maya, Ethan, Sophie, and Max, the dog. Maya's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Sophie tightly. "It's perfect, sweetheart. Just perfect." Ethan watched them, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to hope that their family might have a future together. Maya's improvement was short-lived. Just when it seemed like the new therapy was working, Dr. Patel called Ethan and Maya in for a meeting. "I wish I had better news," Dr. Patel began, her voice measured. "The scans show that while the treatment has slowed the progression, it hasn't stopped it entirely." Maya sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Ethan, seated beside her, felt a wave of frustration and helplessness. "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with urgency. "It means we're running out of options," Dr. Patel admitted. We can try another round of experimental treatments, but the side effects could outweigh the benefits. Maya exhaled shakily, her gaze dropping to the floor. How long do I have? That's difficult to say, Dr. Patel replied gently. Months if the treatments help, but without them. Ethan reached for Maya's hand, his grip firm. We'll fight this, he said, determination blazing in his eyes. Maya looked at him, her expression a mix of gratitude and resignation. I've been fighting, Ethan, but maybe it's time to focus on the time I have left instead of clinging to what I can't control. After much discussion, Maya decided to pause her treatments temporarily. She wanted to spend her energy on Sophie and the moments that mattered most. Ethan supported her decision, though it pained him to watch her grow weaker. Together, they planned outings that Sophie would treasure, trips to the park, afternoons baking cookies, and quiet evenings filled with bedtime stories and cuddles. One weekend, Ethan took them to a nearby lake. Maya, wrapped in a blanket, sat on the shore as Sophie and Ethan splashed in the water. You look happy, Ethan said when he returned to her side. I am, Maya replied, her voice soft but steady. This is all I've ever wanted for Sophie, to be safe and loved. And she is, Ethan assured her. Because of you. Maya reached for his hand, her touch light but meaningful. Because of us. As Maya focused on making memories, Sophie hit a milestone that filled the house with joy, her first steps. It happened one quiet evening. Ethan was sitting on the couch, reading a report, while Maya played with Sophie on the rug. No, Sophie exclaimed, pulling herself up on wobbly legs. Maya froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan, she's standing. Ethan dropped the report and rushed to the rug just as Sophie took her first hesitant steps toward Maya. You're doing it, Maya cheered, her voice trembling with emotion. Sophie giggled as she fell into Maya's arms, her tiny face lighting up with pride. Ethan crouched beside them, his heart full. That was incredible, Sophie. Maya kissed Sophie's cheeks, tears streaming down her face. I'll never forget this moment. Ethan's voice softened. Neither will I. Maya's strength began to fade noticeably as the months wore on, but she found comfort in the support of those around her. Claire, once skeptical of Maya, became her fiercest ally, helping with everything from household chores to medical appointments. She's tougher than I gave her credit for, Claire confided to Ethan one afternoon. And she's got a heart of gold. Maya also grew closer to Dr. Patel, whose compassion went beyond the professional. During one particularly difficult appointment, Dr. Patel sat with Maya long after the tests were done, offering words of encouragement and friendship. You're not just a patient, Maya, Dr. Patel said. You're an inspiration. Even Jacob Hart, Ethan's private investigator, played a role in supporting Maya, using his network to connect her with resources and advocates for her condition. People care about you, Maya, Ethan said one evening as they sat on the porch. And not just because of Sophie. You've touched their lives in ways you don't even realize. Maya's health continued to decline, but her spirit remained unbroken. She poured all her love into Sophie, ensuring that her daughter would remember her not for her illness, but for the joy and strength she brought into their lives. One evening, as Maya tucked Sophie into bed, she noticed Ethan standing in the doorway. His expression was tender, his eyes reflecting the weight of everything they had been through. You're a good father, Maya said softly. And you're a good mother, Ethan replied. Maya hesitated, then added, Ethan, if the time comes when I can't be here, promise me you'll tell Sophie about me. Make sure she knows how much I loved her. Ethan walked over and knelt beside her, his hand covering hers. You're not going anywhere, Maya. But if the time comes, I promise. She'll know. Their bond had grown beyond anything either of them had expected. They were a family now, bound not by blood but by love, trust, and shared hope. The peace in their lives was shattered one night when Maya suddenly became unresponsive. Ethan had just finished reading Sophie a bedtime story when Claire burst into the nursery, her face pale. It's Maya, she said, her voice trembling. She's not waking up. Ethan rushed to the guest house, his heart pounding. Maya was slumped in her chair, her breathing shallow. He knelt beside her, gently shaking her shoulders. Maya, can you hear me? It's Ethan. Her eyelids fluttered, but she didn't respond. Panic surged through Ethan as he dialed 911. The paramedics arrived quickly, their efficiency both reassuring and terrifying. Ethan held Sophie tightly as they loaded Maya into the ambulance. She's stable for now, one paramedic said, but we need to get her to the hospital immediately. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. We'll follow. The ride to the hospital was silent. Sophie's small arms wrapped around Ethan's neck. He could feel her trembling, and he whispered reassurances he barely believed himself. At the hospital, Dr. Patel met them with a grim expression. She's in critical condition, Dr. Patel explained. Her body is struggling to cope with the progression of her illness. We're doing everything we can, but this is a delicate situation. Ethan clenched his fists, fighting back tears. Do whatever it takes, he said, his voice hoarse. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Ethan's life. He paced the waiting room, Sophie asleep on his chest, while Claire sat silently nearby. Dr. Patel emerged periodically with updates, but the news was never good enough to ease Ethan's fear. She's stable, but barely, Dr. Patel said during one update. Her body is fragile. This will be a long night. Ethan refused to leave, even as fatigue clawed at him. He replayed every moment with Maya in his mind, the times they laughed together, the milestones they celebrated with Sophie, the quiet conversations that had strengthened their bond. You're not leaving us, he whispered to himself. You're stronger than this, Maya. You have to be. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Dr. Patel approached with a weary but hopeful expression. She's stabilized for now, she said, but the next 24 hours are critical. We'll need to monitor her closely. Ethan exhaled a shaky breath, his relief tempered by the lingering uncertainty. Maya woke up 2 days later, her face pale, but her eyes alert. Ethan was at her bedside immediately, his expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. You scared me, he said, his voice breaking. Maya managed a weak smile. I guess I'm not done fighting yet. Dr. Patel entered, her demeanor professional but warm. You've made it through the worst, Maya, but you need to rest. Your body is still fragile. Maya nodded, her gaze shifting to Ethan. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean to put you through this. Ethan shook his head. Don't apologize. Just focus on getting better. Over the next few weeks, Maya's recovery was slow but steady. Ethan adjusted his schedule to spend more time with her and Sophie, delegating business responsibilities to his trusted team. One evening, as they sat together in the garden, Maya turned to Ethan. I've been thinking, she said hesitantly, about what happens if I don't make it. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. I need to make sure Sophie is okay, Maya continued. I want you to adopt her officially. You've been her father in every way that matters. Ethan's chest tightened. Maya, you're going to be here. We'll raise her together. I hope so, Maya said, her voice soft. But if I'm not, I need to know she's safe with you. Ethan nodded, his resolve firm. You don't have to worry about that. I'll do whatever it takes to protect her. Ethan began the legal process of adopting Sophie, a decision that brought both relief and heartache. Maya worked closely with Jacob and the family lawyer, ensuring every detail was handled with care. The process was emotionally taxing, particularly for Maya. Signing the papers felt like a concession to the possibility of her absence, a reality she still struggled to accept. One afternoon, as Maya reviewed the documents, Sophie toddled over with a book in her hands. Read, Mama, Sophie said, her voice sweet and insistent. Maya smiled, setting the papers aside. Of course, sweetheart. As she read, Ethan watched from the doorway, his heart aching. He knew how much these moments meant to Maya, and he vowed to preserve them for Sophie, no matter what the future held. Despite the looming uncertainty, their little family found joy in the small moments: Sophie's growing vocabulary, movie nights on the couch, and quiet mornings in the garden. Maya's strength began to return in small but meaningful ways. She could play with Sophie for longer stretches, join Ethan for dinner at the table, and even take short walks around the estate. One evening, as they watched the sunset, Maya turned to Ethan. I didn't think I'd have this much time, she said, but I'm grateful for every day. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip steady. We're not done yet, Maya. There's still more time to make memories. Maya smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. Their bond had grown beyond friendship, beyond partnership. It was a deep, unshakable connection forged through love, resilience, and shared hope. Life settled into a tenuous rhythm for Ethan, Maya, and Sophie, but an undercurrent of uncertainty loomed over their days. While Maya seemed stronger, Dr. Patel called Ethan aside during a routine checkup. She's improving for now, Dr. Patel said, her voice cautious. But we've identified an anomaly in her recent tests. It could indicate a resurgence of the illness. Ethan felt the air leave the room. What does this mean? Dr. Patel hesitated. It means we need to prepare for the possibility that the improvement is temporary. We'll monitor her closely, but I wanted you to be aware. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. I'll make sure she knows she's not alone, no matter what happens. He left the hospital determined to shield Maya from the weight of the news. But that night, as they sat on the porch under a blanket of stars, Maya sensed his unease. Something's wrong, she said, her voice soft but firm. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. Dr. Patel is concerned about your last test results, but it doesn't mean we stop fighting. Maya leaned into him, her hand brushing his. Thank you for always being honest with me, Ethan. Whatever comes next, I know we'll face it together. Sophie's second birthday was a celebration that lit up the entire estate. Ethan and Maya worked tirelessly to create a day filled with joy, laughter, and love. The garden was transformed into a wonderland of colorful balloons, streamers, and a small petting zoo, Sophie's favorite. Friends and family gathered, and Claire even managed to coax Jacob into wearing a party hat, much to Sophie's delight. As Sophie blew out the 2 candles on her cake, Maya watched with tears in her eyes. She's growing up so fast, Maya said, her voice tinged with both pride and sadness. She's thriving because of you, Ethan replied, his gaze lingering on her. That evening, after the guests had left and Sophie was asleep, Maya and Ethan sat together in the living room. You've given her everything, Ethan, Maya said, her eyes shimmering with emotion. She'll always have a piece of you to hold on to. Ethan shook his head. She has you too, Maya. Don't forget that. Maya didn't respond, but her expression was far away, as if she were memorizing every detail of the life they'd built. The joy of Sophie's birthday was short-lived. A few weeks later, Maya collapsed again, this time in the middle of the night. Ethan found her on the floor of the guest house, gasping for breath. Maya, he shouted, dropping to his knees beside her. She struggled to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan, Sophie, I'm calling an ambulance, Ethan said, his voice trembling as he reached for his phone. Dr. Patel met them at the hospital, her expression grim. Her body is rejecting the treatment. We're doing everything we can, but it's critical now. Ethan stayed by Maya's side as she drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, her gaze often wandered to the photograph of Sophie he had brought from home. She's what keeps me going, Maya murmured one afternoon, her voice weak but determined. I need her to know how much I love her. She knows, Maya, Ethan assured her, his voice breaking. You've shown her every day. Maya's relapse brought an urgency to their days. Ethan began recording her stories, her laughter, and the way she sang Sophie's favorite lullabies, determined to preserve every moment for the future. One evening, Maya asked Ethan to help her with something she had been working on for weeks. I've been writing letters, she explained, her voice shaking. For Sophie. One for every birthday, so she'll have a piece of me as she grows up. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched her slide a stack of sealed envelopes across the table. Each one was labeled with a year 5, 10, 16, 21. I want her to know how much I love her, Maya said, tears streaming down her face. Even if I can't be there to say it myself. Ethan reached for her hand, his grip firm. You're giving her something priceless, Maya. She'll carry your love with her forever. Over the next few weeks, Maya poured all her energy into creating memories with Sophie. Together, they painted pictures, baked cookies, and planted flowers in the garden. Ethan joined them whenever he could, his heart swelling with love and admiration for the woman who had transformed his life in ways he hadn't thought possible. Dr. Patel called Ethan in for a private meeting to discuss Maya's worsening condition. "We're at a crossroads," Dr. Patel said. "There's one last treatment we can try, but it's high risk. If it fails—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Ethan returned to Maya's bedside, the decision pressing on him like a physical weight. "There's one more treatment," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's risky. I wanted to talk to you before we make a choice." Maya closed her eyes, her expression pained but resolute. "Ethan, I don't want my last moments to be in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines. I want to be with Sophie. I want to be home." Ethan's throat tightened. "Are you sure?" Maya nodded. "Promise me you'll take me home, Ethan. That's where I want to be." Ethan honored Maya's wishes, bringing her home to the guest house she had grown to love. The staff ensured she had every comfort, and Dr. Patel made daily visits to manage her care. In those final weeks, Maya's strength faded, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. She spent every moment she could with Sophie, reading stories and holding her close. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Maya sat on the porch with Ethan and Sophie. "This is perfect," she said, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for giving me this." Ethan leaned closer, his hand resting over hers. "You've given me more than I could ever repay, Maya. You've given me a family." Maya smiled, her gaze drifting to Sophie, who was playing with a toy in the grass. "Promise me you'll always remind her how much I love her." "I promise," Ethan said, his voice breaking. As the stars appeared in the sky, Maya closed her eyes, her expression peaceful. Ethan stayed by her side, holding her hand until the end. The night Maya passed was one of bittersweet peace. The house was hushed, except for Sophie's soft breaths as she slept in her crib. Ethan sat with Maya, holding her hand as her breathing slowed, her eyes opening briefly to meet his. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, her voice so faint he had to lean closer. "For what?" he asked, his throat tight. "For giving me everything I dreamed of," she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "For loving Sophie like your own, and for letting me be a part of this family." Tears rolled down Ethan's face as he whispered, "We'll always be your family, Maya." She nodded, her eyes drifting closed again, a serene expression settling over her face. Ethan stayed with her, holding her hand, until the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. The days following Maya's passing were heavy with grief. Ethan, normally a pillar of strength, found himself faltering as he navigated the emptiness she left behind. Sophie, too young to fully understand, often toddled into the guest house looking for her mother. Each time she called out, "Mama," Ethan's heart broke a little more. One evening, Claire sat with Ethan in the living room as Sophie played nearby. "She's going to need you more than ever," Claire said gently. "But don't forget, it's okay to let yourself grieve too." "I'm trying," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse. "But how do I explain to her that her mother isn't coming back?" Claire placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to explain it all at once. Just show her love. That's what Maya would want." Ethan nodded, determined to honor Maya's legacy by being the father Sophie needed. Ethan began creating a scrapbook for Sophie, filled with memories of Maya photographs, handwritten notes, and clippings of the flowers they had planted together. "This is for you," Ethan told Sophie one afternoon as she sat on his lap. "So, you'll always remember how much your mama loved you." Sophie pointed at a picture of Maya in the garden, her face lighting up. "Manga." Ethan smiled, his chest tightening. "That's right, sweetheart. Your mama was amazing." The scrapbook became a nightly ritual. Each evening, Ethan and Sophie would look through its pages, talking about Maya and the moments they shared as a family. Dr. Patel visited often, checking on both Sophie and Ethan. "You're doing an incredible job, Ethan," she said one afternoon. "Maya would be proud." "Thank you," Ethan replied, his voice soft. "I just want to do right by her." Months after Maya's passing, Ethan found a stack of letters she had written for Sophie. Each one was labeled with a year, starting from Sophie's 3rd birthday. The first letter brought Ethan to tears. Maya had written about her hopes for Sophie's future, her love for her daughter, and her trust in Ethan to guide Sophie through life. She thought of everything, Ethan murmured, running his fingers over the delicate handwriting. When Sophie's third birthday arrived, Ethan read her the first letter. "Dear Sophie," Maya's words began. "Today you're 3 years old. I hope you're running around, laughing, and filling the house with your joy. You've always been my sunshine, and I love you more than words can say." Though Sophie didn't fully understand, she clutched the letter tightly, her small hands tracing the paper as if she could feel her mother's love through it. "I miss Mama," Sophie said softly. Ethan hugged her close. "I miss her too, sweetheart, but she's always with us, in our hearts." Ethan gradually began to find moments of peace. He threw himself into creating a stable, loving environment for Sophie, drawing strength from the memories of Maya. He expanded the garden they had started together, turning it into a sanctuary where Sophie could play and grow. He also started a foundation in Maya's name to support families dealing with terminal illness, ensuring her legacy would touch even more lives. Claire, ever a steadfast presence, helped Ethan navigate the practicalities of parenting while also encouraging him to take time for himself. "You're doing great," she told him one evening. "But don't forget, it's okay to lean on others too." Ethan nodded, appreciating her unwavering support. Sophie continued to thrive, her laughter filling the house with light. Every milestone she reached a new word. Her first day of preschool felt like a tribute to Maya's love and guidance. As time passed, Ethan found himself reflecting on the ways Maya had changed his life. She had opened his heart to love, family, and selflessness. Now, with Sophie growing quickly, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. The foundation he had started in Maya's name flourished. Named the Maya Hope Foundation, it provided resources for families facing terminal illnesses, covering medical costs, counseling, and emotional support. Ethan poured his energy into the project, ensuring no family would face what Maya had endured without help. One day, Claire joined Ethan in the foundation's office, holding a proposal. "You've been so focused on helping others," Claire said, her tone warm. "But what about yourself? I think it's time you let yourself breathe." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "I'm trying, Claire. It still feels too soon." Claire nodded, understanding his hesitation. "There's no timeline for healing, Ethan. But I know Maya would want you to find happiness again." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe one day. Right now, Sophie's my everything." Sophie's vibrant energy became a source of constant joy for Ethan. At 4 years old, she was curious, adventurous, and full of questions. "Daddy," Sophie asked one day, her big eyes wide with wonder, "where do flowers come from?" Ethan crouched down beside her in the garden. "Flowers start as tiny seeds, just like you started as a tiny baby. With sunlight, water, and love, they grow strong and beautiful." Sophie grinned, holding a small daisy in her hand. "Like Mama loved me?" Ethan felt his throat tighten, but managed to smile. "Exactly like that, sweetheart." The garden became their special place, filled with Maya's favorite blooms. Sophie often helped Ethan plant new flowers, her little hands digging into the soil with enthusiasm. "This one's for Mama," Sophie said one day, pointing to a pink rose. Ethan nodded. "She'd love that, Sophie. She'd be so proud of you." At a fundraising gala for the foundation, Ethan met Lila Grant, an event coordinator whose compassion and quick wit immediately caught his attention. Lila approached him during a quiet moment, offering her hand. "Mr. Rivers, it's an honor to meet you. The work you're doing is inspiring." Ethan shook her hand, appreciating her sincerity. "Thank you, but it's not just me. Maya was the heart of this." Lila nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I lost my mother to cancer when I was young. I know how important this work is." Their shared experiences sparked a connection, and over the next few months, Lila became a regular presence in Ethan and Sophie's lives. She often stopped by the house, bringing small gifts for Sophie or helping Ethan with the foundation's projects. One evening, as Ethan and Lila worked late in the office, she glanced at him with a smile. "You know, you're pretty amazing," Lila said. Ethan laughed softly. "I'm just trying to do my best. For Sophie, for Maya." And you're succeeding, Lila replied, her gaze steady. Sophie quickly warmed to Lila, who treated her with patience and kindness. The three of them began spending more time together, often going on small outings to the park or the zoo. One afternoon, while Sophie played on the swings, Lila turned to Ethan. She's incredible, Lila said, nodding towards Sophie. She gets it from her mother, Ethan replied, his tone wistful. Lila hesitated before speaking. Do you ever think about moving forward? Finding someone to share your life with again? Ethan met her gaze, surprised by her honesty. It's crossed my mind, but it's not easy. Maya, she was everything. I'm not saying you should forget her, Lila said gently, but I think she'd want you to be happy. And Sophie, too. Ethan considered her words, the weight of them settling over him. Maybe one day, he said. I'm not there yet, but I appreciate you saying that. Sophie's 5th birthday approached, and Ethan decided to throw a party in the garden, much like they had done for her 2nd birthday. Lila offered to help with the planning, and together they created an event filled with balloons, games, and Sophie's favorite foods. On the day of the party, Sophie ran through the garden in a bright yellow dress, her laughter echoing through the air. Daddy, look! Sophie exclaimed, holding up a butterfly that had landed on her hand. Ethan knelt beside her, smiling. That's beautiful, Sophie. Just like you. As the day wore on, Ethan watched Sophie play with her friends, his heart full. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Lila joined him, holding a plate of cake. You've created something amazing here, Ethan. Not just me, Ethan replied. Maya's always a part of this. Lila placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but comforting. And she always will be. Months after Sophie's birthday, Ethan found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He had built a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose, but he couldn't deny the growing feelings he had for Lila. One evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan invited Lila to join him on the porch. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Ethan began, his voice steady but hesitant. About moving forward. Lila looked at him, her expression unreadable. And I don't know where this could go, Ethan admitted, but I'd like to try, if you're willing. Lila smiled, her eyes bright with emotion. I've been waiting for you to say that. Their first tentative steps into a new relationship were marked by understanding and mutual respect. They didn't rush, but allowed their connection to grow naturally, always mindful of the legacy Maya had left behind. Ethan and Lila's relationship grew quietly, built on mutual understanding and shared values. They often found themselves talking late into the night after Sophie was asleep, discussing everything from their dreams for the foundation to their personal hopes and fears. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace in Ethan's home, Lila glanced at him. I was scared at first, she admitted, her voice soft, to get close to you and Sophie. I didn't want to overstep. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You could never overstep, Lila. Sophie adores you, and so do I. The confession hung in the air, both tender and weighted. Lila smiled, her cheeks tinged with color. I feel the same, she said. But I know this isn't just about us. It's about her, too. Ethan nodded. And we'll take it one step at a time. But I want you to know this feels right. Like it's where we're meant to be. Ethan decided to introduce Lila as more than a friend during a quiet family day at the park. Sophie was busy playing on the swings when Ethan knelt down beside her. Sophie, can we talk for a second? He asked gently. Sophie nodded, her curls bouncing as she looked up at him. You know how Lila spends a lot of time with us? Ethan began. She's fun, Sophie said with a grin. Well, I was thinking she might spend even more time with us. What would you think about that? Sophie tilted her head, considering. Like, she'll live here? Maybe someday, Ethan said. Would that be okay with you? Sophie's face lit up. Yes. Can she help us plant flowers? Ethan laughed, his heart lighter than it had been in years. I think she'd love that. Later that evening, Sophie proudly showed Lila the flowers they had planted for Maya, explaining each one's meaning. This one's Mama's favorite, Sophie said, pointing to a pink rose. And this one is for you. Lila's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Sophie tightly. Thank you, sweetheart. That means so much to me. As months turned into a year, Lila's presence in their lives became a constant source of comfort and joy. She seamlessly integrated into the rhythms of their days, helping Sophie with school projects and assisting Ethan with foundation events. One weekend, as they decorated the house for the holidays, Sophie tugged on Lila's sleeve. "Are you going to be my new mama?" she asked innocently. Lila froze, glancing at Ethan, who knelt beside Sophie. "Sophie," Ethan said gently, "Lila is very special to us. She's not trying to replace Mama, but she loves you very much. Just like Mama did." Sophie considered this, then smiled. "Okay, I like her here." The simple exchange left Ethan and Lila emotional but hopeful. It was a sign that their blended family was truly beginning to take shape. On a crisp spring evening, Ethan planned a quiet dinner at home with Sophie and Lila. After Sophie went to bed, he led Lila to the garden, a place where so many of their memories had been made. "I wanted to bring you here because this place means so much to me," Ethan began, taking Lila's hand. "It's where Sophie and I have built a life and where we've remembered Maya. But it's also where I've started to see a future with you." Lila's eyes widened as Ethan pulled a small box from his pocket. "Lila, I never thought I'd feel this way again, but you've shown me that it's possible to heal, to love, and to hope. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Lila's face as she nodded. "Yes, Ethan. Yes, 1,000 times." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced under the stars. For the first time in years, Ethan felt whole. The wedding was a simple, heartfelt ceremony held in the garden. Close friends and family gathered to celebrate Ethan, Lila, and Sophie's union. Sophie stood between Ethan and Lila during the vows, clutching a bouquet of daisies. "I promise to love and protect you both," Ethan said, his voice steady with emotion. "To honor the family we've built together." When it was Lila's turn, she knelt down to Sophie's level. "And I promise to always be here for you," Lila said, her voice warm. "To love you and your daddy with all my heart." Sophie beamed, wrapping her arms around Lila. As the ceremony concluded, Ethan looked at his new family, his heart filled with gratitude. He knew Maya would always be a part of their lives, but he also knew she would be proud of the love and happiness they had found. In the years that followed, Ethan, Lila, and Sophie thrived as a family. The Maya Hope Foundation expanded, helping countless families in need. Sophie grew into a compassionate, curious child, often helping Ethan and Lila with the foundation's work. One evening, as the family sat together in the garden, Sophie turned to Ethan. "Daddy, do you think Mama can see us?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Ethan smiled, his eyes glistening. "I think so, sweetheart, and I think she's very proud of us." Lila squeezed Ethan's hand, and they watched Sophie chase fireflies across the lawn. In that moment, surrounded by love and laughter, Ethan knew they had honored Maya's legacy. Their story was one of resilience, hope, and the enduring power of love, a story that would continue to grow with every new chapter. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story of resilience, hope, and the power of love, we'd love for you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more emotional and inspiring stories that touch the heart and celebrate the beauty of life. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads. If this story moved you, give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who could use a little hope and inspiration today. Thank you for your support. Together, let's spread love, kindness, and positivity one story at a time. See you in the next narrative.